Let me ask you a question. Does this video bring back any memories?
12, we got a level 1 that's just started the game. Oh, it looks like he's...
If you have answered yes, then there's a good chance you're one of the OG Dungeon Quest players. You may remember back in 2019, Dungeon Quest reached its all-time popularity, notably thanks to content creators like Tofu, Tenka, and Meirushot. All these videos made me remember how good and appealing the old Dungeon Quest really used to be. All this thinking made me question, was it possible for us to enjoy Dungeon Quest again like the good old days? In this video, I will answer the question. Before we dive into whether it's possible to play Dungeon Quest like we did in the past, let's first define what we mean by the good old days of Dungeon Quest. Was it the simplicity of the game, with fewer dungeons, items, and content compared to the myriad of things we have today? Or was it the fact that back then, there was little to no cheating, duping, or exploiting? Perhaps it was because Vikafi was more attentive to the player base, shaping the game around their desires rather than his own ideas. Is it any of these things? Truthfully, it's complicated, and I don't think it's just one of these aspects. The characteristics I've mentioned are common to nearly every game, even beyond Roblox. But does that mean that these games were loved from the start? That's not certain. However, if there's one thing that I believe unites all the OG Dungeon Quest players, it's the very first experience they had when playing the game. In gaming, first impressions matter. A lot. It's no wonder Dungeon Quest drew in so many players back in the day. Admittedly, Dungeon Quest didn't immediately explode in popularity. It took about a year after its release before it really started to take off. Video after video popped up on YouTube, and I remember seeing this game on the popular game page. That's how big it was. So, what truly is Dungeon Quest nostalgia? As I mentioned, it's simply that very first experience and the image you formed of the game. I'm generalizing here, but Dungeon Quest could have been for you a game where you could be a mighty warrior, knight, wizard, mage, or healer. Whatever you wanted, really. As long as you were motivated to farm and gather enough loot, that is. For me, and this might sound a bit silly, I used to imagine Dungeon Quest was a lot like Skylanders, a game I played intensely as a kid. I used to think Dungeon Quest felt like Skylanders, but with more freedom. I could be a mage, a warrior, or a healer. I could equip different, shiny, and cool-looking armor however I wanted. Ultimately, it was this freedom to play however I wanted that drew me in. There was no tutorial or guide dictating every step. Which brings me to my next point. This might sound a bit confusing, but bear with me. Does today's Dungeon Quest offer less freedom than it once did? The question is debatable, but it's worth exploring. There are pros and cons to having more or less freedom in a game. On the one hand, if you're guided every step of the way, your desire to explore and farm the game can disappear, leaving little reason to play or even enjoy it. On the other hand, if you're left to fend for yourself with little guidance, the game can quickly become boring and you might lose interest. In my view, there should always be a balance between the two. But does this apply to Dungeon Quest? The Dungeon Quest of today starts with you spawning directly into the first dungeon with a little introduction. Upon completing the dungeon, you're told to upgrade your loot and create a new dungeon run, after which you're left on your own. I remember when I first played Dungeon Quest, there wasn't even a tutorial. I had to learn the basics through experience, YouTube, or the wiki, though I rarely used the latter. From what I've described, you might think that without any guidance, I would have felt lost and incapable of progressing, leading me to quit earlier on. But that wasn't the case. Not for me, or for the tens, hundreds, or even thousands of other players who joined around the same time. The truth is, for experienced players, the freedom of Dungeon Quest hasn't changed much from 2019 to today, except for some substantial changes in the tutorial, which is meant to give new players a strong first impression. I agree that throwing new players straight into a dungeon is a good idea, but if they have no choice in the matter and don't want to start their journey by farming and grinding immediately, then today's Dungeon Quest may indeed offer less freedom than before. It's only after completing the tutorial that players are truly on their own. In my opinion, Dungeon Quest's tutorial should be optional and revamped. It's crucial for new players to feel free in a game that becomes increasingly complex. Now that we've discussed what we're nostalgic for and how today's version of Dungeon Quest has evolved, it's time to address the big question. If you play Dungeon Quest the way you usually do, thinking about how many runs it would take you to get that elusive EIF, or whether you've found the best spell, Dungeon Quest might start to feel less like a game and more like a machine, so to speak. So the real question would be, what was Dungeon Quest meant to feel like? What experiences were you supposed to have while playing? Was it always about farming and grinding for loot and levels until you finished the game? Is that even what a dungeon crawler truly is? And would you say that the old game is entirely gone? I don't think so. You can still play the old dungeons, even the Desert Temple and Winter Outpost if you've been around long enough. The old armor is still available. Sure, some of it was removed and is now limited, but that doesn't stop you from acquiring it through trades. There's nothing stopping you from creating a new account and starting from scratch. You still have that freedom. Notice how I use the word freedom here. Certainly, Voldex has made significant changes to the game, but nothing stops you from ignoring those changes and just enjoying the game. Admittedly, they've left more marks on the game than ever before, but change isn't always a bad thing, it just depends on what that change is. We need to accept that the good old days are called that for a reason. They happened, and they ended. So is it possible to enjoy Dungeon Quest like before? I would say yes, as long as you're willing to play and experience the game differently. Of course, there's not much you can do if the developers decide to remove or add a particular feature. And you might argue that new players won't understand what I'm talking about since they never knew the old Dungeon Quest anyway. That's true, but the same logic applies to any game. What stops you from creating an alt and starting over? You can even access the old dungeons from your main account by creating an extra slot, saving you both time and effort. I hope that one day, Voldex will fix the damage it has done to the game. I could go on and on about the community's complaints and the things that need fixing. Honestly, if Voldex is watching this video, you should consider listening to your community rather than your sponsors. I don't know about you, but Dungeon Quest isn't about ads, monthly events, or overpriced cosmetics no one really cares about. We just want to play the game, plain and simple. Every good time comes to an end, but so do bad times. Anyways, that was it for this introspective analysis of whether DQ could be enjoyed as it once was. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If so, then don't hesitate to leave a like and subscribe to never miss out when I upload every week. Yeah. Well, that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.